Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here. Before we launch into our Blessed series, I just want to take a moment of your time and tell you about an incredible opportunity that we would love for you to be a part of. Every Thanksgiving, we partner with organizations around the globe to bring God's love and light to the people that call this planet home. This year, one of the projects we'll be raising money to support is Hope for Liberia. Check out this brief message from our friend Joe Amaral to learn about this worthy cause.
Hey, good morning, Lake Point Family Church in Leamington, Ontario. This is Joe Amaral, and I'm in Liberia. And I just want to thank you guys so much for all the support that you've shown to Hope for Liberia. Thank you for praying for us, and thank you for supporting us, and thank you for considering your ongoing support to what we're doing here in Liberia. In April of 2019, I came here for the first time, and God really broke my heart and spoke to my heart about this place, about doing something significant in this area. And so God gave me a dream and said, buy 5 acres of land on the main road. And so here it is, 5 acres of land on the main road. We dug a well a couple of years ago, and the kids love playing in the water, that clean, safe drinking water. And here we have our multi-purpose community center where we train people, we provide seminars for the community, and it also houses our church services on Sunday morning. But today I want to talk to you about something really special that we're asking you to consider partnering with us in, and that is our brand new school building. Come and check it out with me. So this building started off as a dream. When God showed me the original piece of land in that vision that He gave me, I saw a community center, I saw a medical clinic, and I saw a school. And thanks to the ongoing support of our partners and partners like you, we're actually making that dream a reality. This school is going to house just over 400 students, and classes start in November. And you can see we still have a long way to go, and the guys are working hard. They're sleeping here on the site. They're working from the time the sun comes up till the sun goes down because they want to get it ready in time for the first week of November, because that's when school is starting this year. Let me show you what's going on inside. All right, before we head on inside, we're actually standing in the area where there's going to be a basketball court, a professional basketball court, great size, concrete floor, painted lines, basketball nets. It's going to be the only one of its kind in the area. We're so excited. This place is called the Community of Hope, and that's what we want to do. The Hope for Liberia wants to bring hope, guess what? For Liberia. And part of that is elevating this community so that people will have something to look forward to, something to build them up and provide them with hope. Good morning, guys. These are some of our hard-working team. Everybody say, hey, Canada. Hey, Canada. We got a new dog? Yeah. Morning, guys. Yeah. Morning. All right, so we came through the main entrance, and we have offices to the side here for the principal and for reception. And when you come in here, this is our beautiful common area. And we have 7 classrooms on each side. Yeah, so 7 down here. We have 7 down here. And this place isn't just going to be beautiful with black and white tiled floors. It's going to look fantastic, but it's going to serve as the area where we also feed the children every day. And this is where we're asking you guys to consider partnering with us. With 360 students coming in November, we want to make sure that we provide them with breakfast and lunch every day when they come to class, because we want them to focus on their education, on the math and science and English, and not on the growling of their bellies. So we're asking you to consider sponsoring 1 child for the entire year. And that's $400 will ensure that 1 child will get a breakfast and a lunch every day of the school year for 10 months. So if you can help us with a gift, a one-time gift of $400, and that student will be covered. Either way, we appreciate you so much. We love you. We are so thankful for what God is doing here. And thank you for considering being a part of what we're doing here in bringing hope to Liberia. God bless you.
If you would like to sponsor the meals for a child at the brand new school in Liberia, come prepared to give on October 10th or 17th. You'll be able to give by visiting lakepoint.church/give, our Lakepoint app, or if you're here on site, you'll be able to use one of our drop boxes located at the entrances and exits of the auditorium, or the debit machine at our welcome desk. Thank you for watching and enjoy this message from Pastor Nate.
Well, good morning, friends. How's everybody doing today? Good. A few of you. The rest of you awake? I just wanted to just reiterate a couple of things you just watched in that video. The first thing is we have great news. Our midweek junior high program is sold out. It is maxed out, so we're excited about that. So if you missed it, you'll have to wait to the new year. The other thing, as you heard from Michael, is our Thanksgiving offering is approaching. If you're newer to Lake Point, you're watching online, every year we just give generously to visionary projects, to organizations that we like to promote here at Lake Point. And, I was telling our board of directors this week, over the last 3.5 years through our Thanksgiving offering, we've actually raised $185,000 that we've just given away to bless other organizations that are doing good around the world. And that's because of your generosity. And so thank you for that. You heard from Joe. He's on site right now in Liberia. And they have this vision to feed these 400 students. And Liberia is actually one of the top 5 poorest countries in the world. And so we just want to bless Joe and bless Liberia and bless this community of hope. And so we will invite you to give to that or one of the other 2 projects you're going to hear about over the next couple of weeks. All right, well, this past week on Wednesday evening, some of the guys from our life group, we met up at the Crave restaurant here in town to enjoy some delicious chicken wings. Anybody here ever been to the Crave restaurant? Anybody? Some of you, maybe a better question, anybody here a fan of chicken wings? Chicken wings, anybody? Oh, yeah. And so we were enjoying these chicken wings, and I was sitting there in the back, and I was looking at the building, and my vantage point was upstairs. I could see the upstairs part of the building, and I was just, in that moment, I was reminded of the incredible rich heritage that we enjoy as a church and all of the growth that we've seen from seeing more and more people connected to Jesus. You see, some of you know our story, and you know this, that it all began in the summer of 1931. In the summer of 1931, when a church in Windsor sent some people here to Leamington, and they set up some tents over on Elliott Street, and they began to share in some gospel tent meetings. Now, you have to remember, back then, there was no television. There certainly was no internet or Netflix. And so people were looking for things to do, and they were curious about these tent meetings. And so people began to attend them, and they heard about what Jesus Christ had done for them. And some of these people came to put their faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And so soon there was this growing group of new Christ followers. And as a couple of months transitioned by, the weather started to get cooler in the fall season, and they realized they couldn't meet in tents all winter. And so they decided to rent some space here in town in the upper room of this storefront facility, which we now know as the Crave restaurant. And so I was sitting there last Wednesday thinking, wow, this is incredible. This is where our church began. And as they continued to promote both the message and the ministry of Jesus within our community, that little fledgling group began to grow at more and more. And so soon, this physical space right up here couldn't contain them. And so they began to sacrificially pool their resources and their money together. And they purchased a property here in town over on Queen Street. And they constructed their very first building of their own. It's what we would know as the Gallery Restaurant. And God continued to bless them. In fact, as they sought the power of the Holy Spirit, they began to be sent out on mission to share the good news of Jesus with people in the community. And they continued as a congregation to grow in both size and in influence. And so eventually, they outgrew their space once again. And so they made the decision to buy bigger property on the edge of town, right over there, actually, on the other side of the highway, in which is now known, as many of you know, as St. Anthony's Parish. And so there's this great big property and this great big building, But once again, as they committed themselves to the message and the ministry of Jesus, as they shared their faith with other people, that community of believers continued to grow. And so once again, they purchased a bigger property across the street, the property that we're sitting in right now, 285 Talbot. And in 85, they constructed our first building on this property over where our kids now meet. And the church continued to grow as the message of Jesus was proclaimed. And so some of you were a part of this. Some of you actually, you physically not just gave of your resources, but of your time to help build this room we're in right now. Because in 2001, this beautiful auditorium was built and dedicated to God. And then 15 years later, many of you were a part of this. In 2016, we added on once again, and we built our new cafe facilities, which has really become the central hub, the central meeting place for community in our church. And you know, friends, we're not done yet. Our hope is in the next 5 years to add on a brand new family ministries facility to our church, probably east of us here on this direction, to serve all of our Lake Point kids and Lake Point Junior High students. So we're not finished. But I tell you that story simply to look back and to celebrate all that God has done, and also to remind you this, that this fall actually marks our 90th anniversary since Lake Point began. And you know, it got me thinking because a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege right here on stage to officiate in the funeral of Pastor Paul Scheller. And some of you know Pastor Paul and Ida. They were retired missionaries and pastors that were a part of our church congregation. And a few weeks ago, we celebrated his life. And as I was celebrating his life, it dawned on me that Pastor Scheller was actually born. He was conceived and birthed the same year that this church was planted and birthed in our community. It was the year 1931. Now, question for you. For those of you that are on site, was anybody here born in 1931? Anybody born in 1931? No, nobody. Some of you look old, but you're not that old, right? I thought I would wake you up for that statement. And so there's actually, I think, a couple of people I made note of who were born the year later from our church in 1932. I don't know if anyone here, though, was born in 1931. My guess is not. And so I wanted to just remind you of what took place in 1931, since most of us don't have a point of reference in our brain since we weren't alive back then. 1931 was a very difficult year, not just for Leamington, but for really the whole world, but especially for Canada. You see, in 1931, we were at the peak of the Great Depression. This worldwide economic collapse that just drove a lot of people into extreme poverty. I mean, just for a point of reference, today, 7% of the population here in Canada is unemployed. And for a lot of them, it's because they're not able to work. But if you go back to 1931, 27% of Canadians were unemployed. 27%. And so people were struggling just to put food on the table for their kids. Now, to make matters worse, though, people were already in a very fragile kind of emotional state because of all of the trauma that they had just walked through over the previous 15, 20 years. You see, Canada had gone through two very traumatic events. The first was World War I, which began in 1914. And Canada sent 425,000 troops overseas to fight in battle. And some of you might know this, that 61,000 of those young men and women, they died in combat. And another 172,000 were injured in battle. And so for every 2 soldiers that Canada sent overseas, one of them either didn't come back or came back with injuries. And so that was difficult. But then, you know, Canada didn't really catch a break. The world didn't really catch a break because directly following World War I in 1918, the Spanish flu, this global pandemic, swept the globe, and it killed more than 50,000 Canadians, many of them, most of them, in fact, between the ages of 20 and 40 years of age. And so Canada, in a decade or so, was stripped of so much of its youth, so much of its potential. I mean, they were kind of spiraling. They were lost. They were confused. They were hungry. They were poor. And yet, during this crazy, crazy time in history, a time that I personally can't relate to in any way. During this crazy time in history, God motivated some people from a church in Windsor to come over to Leamington and plant a church here in town. And I don't know about you, but I am so incredibly glad that they did. I mean, when I think about it, there potentially was hundreds, if not thousands of people that would have missed out on a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ if they hadn't, despite all of the chaos around them, decided to go and to make a difference. So you might wonder, well, that's great, Nate. Thanks for the history lesson, but why are you telling us this? Well, back during our second lockdown, back in the winter, back in February, we made a decision as a leadership team to partner with a consulting firm from the States called Unstuck, the Unstuck Group. And they really, their mandate is to specialize in helping local churches work so that they can experience sustained health and growth. So they never kind of get into maintenance mode where they're just kind of treading water, but they're a church that always experiences health and growth. And so one of the things we did in working with Unstuck is they helped us revisit our mission. They took us back to the beginning and said, why was your church started? Why do you exist? What has kind of united your people over the decades? And the other thing they helped us do, and they did dozens of things, but another thing they helped us do that would be interest to you, is they helped us identify some of our growth areas. Some of the areas where we as a church family have kind of grown idle or complacent or stuck. Now, I got to admit to you as I'm telling you this, in some ways, it felt like a terrible time to be talking about these big leadership ideas because things were kind of spiraling, nowhere during this time where we were working with Unstuck. I mean, first, we were in the middle of what would be, we didn't even know it at the time, but 3 lockdowns, which would cause all sorts of disruption both inside and outside the church. Second reason why it wasn't the most ideal time to be working on big leadership ideas was because the church and society at that point was already starting to become fragmented, right? With all of the controversy surrounding masks and surrounding vaccines and surrounding the role of government in society. And then on top of that, third, our pastoral team was dealing with a number of health issues in addition of just being, like probably many of you, physically tired and emotionally worn out from a very exhausting past 12 months. Yet as I heard a mentor of mine just say the other day, he said this. He said, vision is uncertainty's worst nightmare. Vision, a plan for the future, is uncertainty's worst nightmare. And we are experiencing right now as a society a lot of uncertainty, the most uncertainty that a lot of us have ever experienced. And yet, if we can envision God's future for our lives, then that can really combat the uncertainty that we face. And so we decided back in the winter that we were going to forge ahead. And for the past 6 months, I've been working with this group called Unstuck. And one of the things that we felt God lead us to do was to revisit and reword our mission statement. You see, 9 plus years ago, I became your lead pastor. And one of the first things we did is we said this: our mission here at Lake Point is we are going to become fully devoted followers of Christ. And that mission statement served us well. But as the world has changed and as we've changed, and even just with COVID, we felt like it was time to re-articulate our vision, our mission, I should say, in a way that was even easier to understand for people and was easy to remember and language that was compelling in nature. And so we looked back on our 90-year history and said, what has God consistently united us around? What are we passionate about? What's our mission? And what's going to be our mission into the future? And it quickly became apparent that there was 2 things that really united us. The first was this, was our desire to connect more and more people to the person of Jesus Christ, right? Like that's why our church started in the first place. And that's why we've always grown, because we've always made it about Jesus, not about us. And then the second thing we realized we were really passionate about was helping people grow to love God and love others wholeheartedly. Like we don't want to just be all about a vertical relationship or just all about social concerns, a social relationship. We want to be about both. We want to see people never stop growing. So they get to the point where they actually love God and love people wholeheartedly. And so it was really simple to come up with the language. We said this: our mission is to connect people to Jesus and help them love God and others wholeheartedly. So that was the easy point. But then as we began to look at some of the growth areas of Lake Point, we quickly realized that there was one area that we felt like almost everybody, like 95% of our church family, was kind of stuck in and needed some help to grow. And this included us as a pastoral team. This included our elected leaders. This included our life group leaders, our volunteers, our regular, attending people. And it was this: our greatest growth area was relational evangelism. Relational evangelism. Now, if you're watching online and you're new to church and you don't even know what the word evangelism is, it simply means to evangelize, to share your faith, to share the good news about Jesus. And obviously, relational evangelism means you're not kind of grabbing your soapbox and going to the four corners in town and standing up on your soapbox with a megaphone and you begin preaching to the people walking by. Relational is that we do this through the relationships that God has blessed us with. Now, I don't know about you, but I would be curious to know, what is your, not even your first thought, but how do you feel when you hear these words, relational evangelism? You see, for me, I kind of feel conflicted. Let me tell you why. I know this. I know that my faith has made a really big difference in my life. In fact, I would say my faith has radically changed my identity. I see myself as a child of God. It's the most important part, the most essential part of my life. I also know this, that my faith can make a really big difference in other people's life, that giving them faith in Jesus Christ, helping them discover faith in Jesus, could really help them. But then I also kind of feel conflicted, though. Because I'm like, this whole idea of evangelizing and trying to make converts and kind of projecting, your beliefs onto another person and trying to radically change their worldview, that feels a little uncomfortable for me. Like, I've never been a salesperson, and I envy those that are good at it. But for me, it feels very contrived. It kind of feels like I'd be selling a used car to somebody, or worse yet, being a part of a pyramid scheme. And so I feel uncomfortable with that. And maybe you do as well. In fact, my guess is many of you do. And the reason why I know you do is because many of you are Canadians, right? Good old Canadians. And Canadians, if you didn't know this, around the world are considered humble. They're considered down to earth. They're considered very tolerant and diplomatic. And because many of us are Canadians, we've been influenced by our Canadian values. And so this idea of, going out and sharing our faith every day feels a little bit radical to us. And so the good news I've got for you today and over the next number of weeks is we believe there's a way for every single one of us, every single day, to be engaged in relational evangelism. And it doesn't require a personality transplant. It doesn't require you changing your nationality. And so we're excited to share this approach with you. And it's very, very biblical. It's rooted in Scripture. It's rooted in the heart of God. And we call it the blessed strategy. And we first see it in the Bible in Genesis chapter 12, when God calls this man Abraham to become, I guess you could say, the very first missionary in our world. Look at what it says. Chapter 12, verse 1. It says, God says to Abram, he says, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. So what we see is he's calling him, he's sending him out to do this global work. And then this next two verses are very telling. God says to Abram, he says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. And I will bless those who bless you and curse those who mistreat you, and all the people, all of the families, all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, what you can see here is that there's a certain word, it's pretty obvious, is used 5 times in those 2 verses. And it's this idea of blessing. God says, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing to others. I'm going to bless those who bless you, and everybody in the world is going to be blessed through you. And so if you're taking notes today, what we see is this. What we see is this, is God's very first strategy for reaching the world was blessing. His very first strategy for reaching you and me was blessing. And we see this in Genesis chapter 12, right? God picks one man, not a great guy, just an ordinary guy. And he says, you're going to be my vehicle. I'm going to bless you, not so that you can just be the recipient of great blessing, but rather so that you can be the conduit, so that everybody, you and everyone who comes after you, who follows in faith, all the way to Jesus, all the way to us today in the 21st century, I'm going to bless you so that you can go and be a blessing. And so we're blessed to be a blessing. We say we're blessed to bless. That's the purpose why we're blessed. And now, just so you know, this concept is not new to me. I mean, I grew up in this church, and I saw it modeled from so many of you, and so I get this idea. But it wasn't until last fall, when I was taking an online missions course with some global workers around the world, that I discovered this. That there are actually 395 passages throughout Scripture that either paraphrase or abridge this passage, this concept, blessed to be blessed. I had no idea that there's 395 times woven throughout the Old and the New Testament where God basically says, hey, I've blessed you for a reason, to go and to be a blessing, because this is my strategy to reach my world. And so what we see from this is that God has always been a missionary God, right? Like sometimes we think that God's mission to save our world began when he sent his son Jesus to earth, or when Jesus said to his followers, go and make disciples. But no, God's always been a missionary God. And from the very beginning, his desire has been to bless us, and in doing so, bless the world so that they would be connected to him. Now, that being said, the very best model for what it looks like to go and bless, of course, is Jesus himself, because his entire life was lived on mission, and his entire life was one of blessing. Everybody he came into contact with, he blessed. Now, with that in mind, I want to introduce you today to some names that you're going to become a bit familiar with. They're two pastors, and they're not here on site. They're not here in Canada. They're actually two pastors from the States. They're brothers, in fact. Their names are Dave and John Ferguson. I've been familiar with them for many, many years. And 30 years ago, they planted a church, a reproducing church in the suburbs of Chicago, which they still pastor. They also went on to lead a global church planting movement called New Thing. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about the Ferguson brothers is because they spent some serious time studying the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament, to look at the practices of Jesus when it came to his ability to befriend and bless people. And so they studied all the things that Jesus did, and they made a list. And then they boiled that list down to the top 5 things that they believe it's possible for you and I to emulate in our everyday lives when it becomes our role and responsibility to bless others. And then they did, and this is probably what they're really, really good at in the kingdom of God. It sounds simple, but it's very true, is they're really, really good at taking complex things and making them really simple by using language that anybody could grasp, but not just grasp, but easily remember. And so they took these 5 things, and I want to share them with you today and then unpack them over the next number of weeks. And they're what we call the BLESS strategy, BLESS, which is an acrostic. 5 everyday ways that you can love your neighbor being the people you live, work, and play with, and then literally change the world. And so B, that stands for begin with prayer. The L stands for listen. The E is my favorite, of course. It stands for eat. That's part of it, relational evangelism. And then the S stands for serve your neighbors. And then the final S stands for share your story. So for many years now, the Ferguson brothers have been training people in these 5 practices. But this past spring, for the very first time, they released a book articulating these practices with real-life stories and examples. And over the summer, all of our board and our pastoral team has read through this book together. And a month ago, we gave a copy of this book to every one of our life group leaders. The reason why is because over the next 6 weeks, we want to share with you everything we learned and are challenged by. And we don't want you just to kind of sit there, whether you're at home today or up in the balcony or here on ground level. We don't want you to sit there and just kind of listen and absorb a little bit of it. Rather, our desire is that everyone who calls Lake Point home would actually intentionally digest what we share. And what we say here at Lake Point is the best way to do that is to belong in a life group where you can actually get in and grapple with what we talk about, because all of our life groups are what we call sermon-based life groups. A year ago, we transitioned to sermon-based life groups where every time our life group meet, they actually watch a recap video, an 8-minute recap video that Pastor Michael produces on Mondays of the sermon, and then they discuss it in their group, and that's really accessible to the whole world. In fact, another church in town was using for one of our series our curriculum that we created, and so this is our website, lakepoint.church/media. You can go there anytime. All of our content is there. So this was last week's message that you could rewatch, which probably no one but my mom does. I get that. But then down here, there's 3 options. First is discussion questions that you can download to your phone, a PDF file. Second is the recap video that Pastor Michael produces. And then third is the sermon notes. And so we would encourage everybody to be good stewards of your time, both here on Sundays and your time here on planet Earth, by fully digesting what God is speaking to us as a faith community. And so you can even do that if you're like, COVID, not so crazy about getting to know a bunch of people, right? You can even do that in the privacy of your own home. You can do that with your spouse. You can do that with your family devotions, right? Take 10 minutes after supper one night. You can do that with a colleague at work who maybe attends Lake Point as well on your lunch break. But we want to encourage you to dive in and fully digest, not just hear, but listen and obey to what God is inviting us to do. So with our time left today, what I want to do is I want to walk you through the B of bless. And it's begin with prayer. And I want to lead with this quote that one of the authors, Dave Ferguson, says. This is such a good quote. He says, I cannot change the world, right? You cannot change the world. Even prayer doesn't change the world. Only God can change the world. However, God uses prayer to change us, and then God uses us to change the world. Oh, that is such a good quote. And then Corrie ten Boom, the Holocaust survivor, she wrote this. She said, we never know how God will answer our prayers, but we can expect that he will get us involved in his plan for the answer. That's why prayers are dangerous, right? As we did our dangerous prayer series. Because when you begin to pray, God begins to get you involved with the answer. That's the power of prayer. And so the very first step to be a blessing is to begin each day by praying for people. Now, a week ago Friday, I was taking Abby to an appointment in Windsor. And so on the way home, we drove through Essex, is where I lived when I was doing Bible college and first started working. And so I drove her past the apartment building where I first kind of started out on my own. I think I was about 5-6 months before getting married. And so I got this apartment building. It was in this complex, this old building that this guy had renovated into an apartment complex, 2 stories, about 20 units or so. And I was excited to get the place. And so before I moved in, though, I decided I was going to spend a few nights painting the whole apartment. So it was nice for Rachel from when we got married and whatnot. I remember the first night I went there. It was a Wednesday night. It was after youth. I was a youth pastor. I'd spent a long day at work. I'd spent 13 hours in the office. I remember getting there around 10 o'clock, and I got my paint cans, and I'm getting set to paint, and I open the paint can in the living room, and as I'm going to pour my paint, I hear some voices, which kind of creeped me out, okay? So I was like, is there somebody in the apartment with me? Like, that's a little spooky. So I grabbed, a paintbrush or a bat or whatever I had. I don't think a paintbrush was going to do much damage. I grabbed something, and I began to kind of tiptoe through the apartment, and I looked behind the shower curtain, I looked behind the hot water tank. I was like, where are these voices coming from? I looked the whole apartment, wasn't that big, and found nothing. Came back empty, so I went back, and I started painting again in the living room. But as I started painting, I heard the voices again. And so I stopped, and I got down low. And as I got down low, I realized the voices were coming from the floor beneath me in the apartment building on level 1. And I was like, oh man, that's not very good, right? Like, you can hear people below you. And as I was kneeling down, not only could I hear them, but I could actually make out their entire conversation. And some of you have heard this story before. I was 21. I was still pretty shy and fairly private person. And so this was like really demotivating for me. Like, I don't want to move into an apartment building, where I'm going to be able to hear everybody and the walls next to me and the floor below me. And so I remember I just kind of I won't do this, but I laid down on the floor on my back with my arms spread out. And I began lamenting to God. I'm like, God, are you kidding me? Like, you blessed me with this crappy apartment where I'm going to hear everybody's business, and they're going to hear my business. And I was like, just telling them how disappointed I was and discouraged. And after a while, I kind of got tired of doing that because God never said anything. So I just laid there on the floor, and I was bored. And once again, no smartphones back then, no internet on your phones. And so I was like, man, what am I going to do now? So I just laid there, and I did the one thing I could think of, and that was eavesdrop on the conversation below me, right? I was like, hopefully it's an entertaining conversation. And as I listened, I realized that there was this middle-aged woman and this young adult boy, male, and it sounded like that they were very stressed, very, very apprehensive. And I seemed to make out that one of them was going for surgery the next morning. And so as I was laying there, I felt like God said to me, you need to go down there and talk to them. And I'm like, God, I'm not going and talking to them. Like, number one, it's now 10:30, and you should know that our apartment, it faces a big open cornfield, so it's pitch black, okay, on the edge of town. And so that's going to be creepy, somebody walking out of the cornfield into their door. Like, that's what you see in movies, right? And so God's like, no, you should go talk to them. And I was like, I don't want to talk to them. What am I going to say? He's like, go talk to them. So I was like, fine. So I walk outside, and I go down the staircase, and I walk up to their door, and I'm so nervous, and I knock, right? And it gets quiet inside, as you'd expect. And then a porch light comes on, and then the door slowly opens, and there's this woman, and she's like, can I help you? And I was like, yeah. Actually, I'm moving in upstairs. My name's Nathan, and I just wanted to introduce myself at 10:30 at night, right? And surprisingly, she was really receptive to it. She said, come on in. My son's visiting. You can have a coffee with us. So I came in, and I sat down, and I probably said one of the most awkward things in my life. I said, yeah, the floor is like razor thin, isn't it? They're like, oh, yeah. And I was like, I'm really embarrassed to say this, but I kind of overheard your conversation just now, and I kind of felt like God told me to come down and talk to you. And I was expecting at that point for it to get really awkward, right? But a tear actually started to kind of creep down her cheek, and she said, wow. She said, actually, my son's here. He's sleeping over because next morning I'm driving him to London because he's having open heart surgery, and he's really nervous about it. And he's been asking me these questions about faith and the afterlife. And she's like, I'm kind of a Catholic, and I was praying that God would send someone to answer some of his questions. And I was like, I can do that. In fact, I'm a pastor, and I would be happy to answer your questions. Anyways, I tell you that story not in any way to make me sound impressive, because the reality is there's only a few times in my life where God's literally grabbed my attention and said, go do something in that moment. And so it's not about me. Rather, I tell you that story to ask you this. What if instead of God having to get our attention, grab our attention, and tell us to do something, what if every day we actually just made ourselves available to God and invited him to give us eyes to see the divine appointments that he's setting up along our path? This is what Dave Ferguson says. He says, prayer is both how you discover your mission, and prayer is how you pursue it. You see, God has given each of us a mission, and prayer is often the way we discover and pursue it. I mean, think of the example set before us of Jesus. I mean, prayer was not only how he began his public ministry, but prayer was how he began each day. In the Gospels, in Luke chapter 3, we read of how Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, and a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." And he blessed him, and he commissioned him to his public ministry. And what we read next in chapter 4 is that Jesus is then, from that moment he started his public ministry, he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days to fast and to pray. Right? He began his ministry with prayer, and then he comes back, and the first thing he does, we see in Luke chapter 6, is he does this. Let me read it for you. It's Luke chapter 6, verse 12. It says, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. And at daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be his apostles. And so what he does is, before he selects his disciples, he actually spends all night praying about it. Now, I'll be honest, if this was me, I may have actually just picked the people I liked the best, right? Or I might have picked the people I thought were most competent or most gifted. And yet Jesus actually devoted himself to prayer because he was dependent upon his heavenly Father to guide him in his mission. You see, God's heart has always been to bless people so that they will go and be a blessing. And this is what we see here with the 12 disciples. In fact, most scholars believe this, that you've got the Old Testament, you've got Abraham and his descendants become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And their job is to be blessed so they can be a conduit so the rest of the world can be introduced to God. But they fail their mission because they think they're supposed to be the recipients of their blessing. They kind of think, yeah, chosen status, celebrity status, we're God's people, everyone else is losers, they can go to hell, is basically the way they acted, right? And then, so God's like, no, that's actually not it at all. And so he sends his son Jesus. And then Jesus does the exact same thing God did in the beginning. And he goes and blesses people. And a lot of scholars actually believe that the 12 soon-to-be apostles were kind of like the equivalent of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because God was relaunching his mission to bless people in order so they can bring blessing to his world. Now, you might be sitting here and you might be wondering, well, that's cool. But I'm still kind of stuck on the fact that Jesus prayed, right? Like, why does Jesus need to pray? He's God. He's God. He's God in the flesh. So why does God need to pray? Well, there's two reasons. The first is because even though Jesus was God in the flesh, he purposely took on limitations, human limitations, because he wanted to fully identify and relate to us as human beings. But the second reason is this. Jesus lived a life that'd be an example for us of how to be fully human and how we should live. And so Jesus came to model for us how we're to live our lives when we live our lives in God. And so the first step is, when it comes to blessing people each day, is to begin with prayer. But I was thinking about this, and the problem with prayer is prayer, for a lot of us, kind of reminds us like this. This right here is something I know you all love and do every day, right? Or at least you lie and tell your dental hygienist you do. It's called flossing. Anybody here flossed in the last 24 hours? Oh, good. I'm glad Trevor did. The rest of you I'm worried about. So flossing, right? Flossing is something we know is important and we should do, but we don't always do it, do we? And there's lots of reasons for that. Sometimes we don't pray because, I'm trying to tuck my floss away here, because we don't really know how, because we're only taught as a kid and we never really learned as an adult. Or for some of us, we don't pray because we're too busy, because it takes time and energy and effort. And those are things we don't feel like we have a whole lot of, right? Or sometimes we don't pray because we're not really convinced that prayer works. Like, we've tried it and it doesn't really seem to make that big of a difference. So we decide not to. There's lots of reasons why we don't pray. But I want to challenge you today that if you're going to live your life on mission, and we're inviting everyone who returns to Lake Point, to live their lives on mission, then I want to remind you that it begins with prayer. This is what Dave says. He says, in prayer, we open ourselves up to God and to the leading of his Spirit inside of us. In prayer, we focus our minds to recognize his promptings. And in prayer, we receive the direction we need. This is so important, to discover the people that God is calling us to bless. I have an old friend, haven't seen him in a while, but I noticed last week on Facebook, he posted this as his status. He said, I spent the first 35 years of my life talking to Jesus. And he said, I think I'm going to try spending the next 35 years just listening. And friends, what if that maybe for some of us became our approach? See this guy, Dave Ferguson, the guy who wrote this book and is this pastor of pastors, he's had this practice for well over a decade where he takes his prayer journal every morning and he opens it up and he draws a line halfway horizontally across his page. And the first half of his page is to journal some of his thoughts as he talks to God. But the bottom half of the page is for him to simply just listen. And he's such an honest guy. Like, he's such an everyday guy, because he says, often I don't hear anything. Right? That's normal. Often I don't hear anything. But sometimes, he says, God will bring a name to mind and he'll write that name down and he'll begin to pray for them. And then he'll seek ways as he interacts with that person to begin to bless them. And that's what I want to encourage you to start doing this week as we launch this Bless campaign. This past week, I received, my phone's back there, but I received a text from a guy that I don't know incredibly well, but I got to know a couple years ago and haven't seen him since COVID began. And he just texted me and he said, "Hey, Nate, I just wanted you to know that I was praying this morning." He lives in London, and he said, "God brought your name to my mind and told me to pray for you. So I just wanted you to know I'm praying for you today." I thought that was really cool. Like that was really nice from a guy to a guy to actually do that. And what's even crazier is that's the third time it's happened in 2021 where someone I haven't seen in years has texted me and said, "Hey, God brought your name to my mind today, and he told me to pray for you." I don't think that's ever happened before in my life, and 3 times in 1 year. But here's kind of the humbling and cool thing, though, about me, is that that's actually not that uncommon because of you. Because you see, let me start at the beginning. When I was conceived in my mother's womb, I had such amazing godly grandparents that they began praying for me every single day. And then I became a pastor. And so many of you, especially as lead pastor, you've come up to me and you say, "Hey, I just want you to know we lift you and your family up in prayer every day." And so I feel so incredibly blessed, humbled that people every day would pray for me. But here's what I want to leave you with today, and it's this. Is there people that you come across every day who never once had someone pray for them? There's people who didn't grow up in the church, didn't grow up in a Christian home, don't have Christian family members. In fact, it's becoming increasingly common in our society. And never once has anybody prayed for them. Never once has anybody actually just said, "God, would you bless that person today? Would you bless them with the awareness of who you are? And God, would you make me a blessing in their life? Would you use me to bless them so that they can come to know you like I know you?" No one has ever prayed for them. There's people every day in your life that God has placed across your path, people you live with, people you work with, people you play with, where God's like, "You know what? If you'll begin each day in prayer, I'm going to put these people not on just on your mind, but on your heart. I'm going to bless you with a burden that you would go and be a blessing to them." And so that's the thought that I want to leave you with today, and then we'll come back next week, and Michael's going to walk us through the L in bless. Would you bow your heads with me in prayer? If you're watching online at home, would you join us as well as part of our church family? God, I thank you. I thank you that your strategy has always been to bless. You're not a God that's against us. You're a God that's for us. We see that in the very first chapters of Genesis. You created this big, beautiful world and put us in it. And you invited us to rule and to reign with you. And yeah, we messed up. And yeah, we've got a lot of things wrong. But your mission hasn't changed. Your mission is still to bless us so that we can go and be a blessing and point others to you. And I think about 90 years ago, you started that with a bunch of people in a tent over on Elliott Street, and they had no idea that today we would sit where we sit today with such a big reach, not just here, but around the world. And so God, I pray that you would motivate our hearts, all of us, that you would motivate our hearts to be a part of your blessing strategy to this world, that it would start inside of us this week as we begin each day in prayer, that you would bring people to our mind and our hearts that we would begin to pray for, and that we begin to help lead them into a relationship with you, because our mission here is to connect people to Jesus and help them grow to love you and others wholeheartedly. And so we just humbly ask for your favor in this. In Jesus' name, amen.